Hi, everybody. Thank you, Brenda and Jamie, for being with us today live. Happy holidays to everybody. We're going to talk about a holiday subject today, how we can prepare healthy food without losing the flavor. And I want to thank Eleanor for helping to get everything set up and to set up all our classes and continuing through the new year. So thank you so much. If you haven't met me before, anyone who's watching, I work in the public health department. I'm a diabetes educator as well as a registered dietitian nutritionist. And I'm down in the basement along with Michelle Smith and public health nurses and Mona and everybody. So usually here a couple days a week. It's usually like a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday is probably the times that I'll be here in the year to come. My schedule's changing a little bit. So what we're going to talk about today are several different subjects that you see on this slide. We're going to talk about exactly what is flavor, how's it defined, also what particular medical conditions for that. Thank you. What medical conditions or medicines, hello, welcome, or other factors might affect the ability to taste our food fully. What exactly are herbs versus spices? And how can we use them to enhance the flavor of things that we prepare, and also to help reduce fat and sugar in some of the recipes? And then how do we best store them? And then what are some resources? So there are actually a couple different components when we talk about flavor. We talk about smell and taste, making it up. And this, I know you probably can't see this real well, but basically, like I said, we're talking about depending on our noses as well as our tongue and the taste receptors that are there in the tongue. And together, then when we have something go into our mouth, then actually there are nerve endings that take the information from the taste receptors and send them up to the upper part and above our nasal cavity, and that combined with nerves that take in the smells that we are taking in help us to define what we see as flavor. So it's really important, and I think this particularly pertains to any of us that have dealt with COVID in our own families, or we know friends and family that have dealt with it, because we know that that's one of the symptoms related to COVID is that we can lose taste and smell. And so then besides that being frustrating and the other things that can go with it, it also can impact a person's pleasure and quality of life, and what your perception is of those times when you're eating. So it's really incredibly important. There we go. Now let me get rid of this. Sorry, guys. What I clicked wrong. So, like I said, the sense of smell contributes strongly to our perception, and it helps us to determine whether we feel that a food is palatable or not. What we know is that we have taste receptors that turn over about every 10 days in anyone when they're in a healthy state. And when someone is malnourished for whatever reason, if there's an illness going on or if someone has food insecurity, those taste receptors are not going to be regenerated as quickly as they normally would. So that's going to make a difference. And so food will not taste as good or we won't feel like we're really interested in as much if that's been impacted by some level of malnutrition. And one of the things that we see in particular is if someone's diet is not adequate in protein or zinc, that in particular that can slow down the rate at which those taste receptors then are regenerated. And so then we're not going to have the same acuity as we normally would. We also know that different times of life and hormonal changes can impact the rate of taste receptors. For example, any of us women that have been pregnant know that certain foods that maybe we ate before that didn't seem to bother us now during pregnancy are really heightened in their taste factor. Or on the other end, for women, as hormones decline, then oftentimes there will be less of that acute sense of taste and flavor in foods related to a decline in estrogen and other hormones. So also, when we look at people as we all age, then we know that because of the lack of regeneration, then oftentimes we see people adding more salt or adding some type of a flavor to their food because they need it to be able to sense that particular flavor. So, like I said, flavor mixtures can be perceived differently in a younger versus an older person. Oftentimes, if you think about vegetables that you might have kind of turned your nose up at, so to speak, when you were young, and now as you've gotten older, you go, huh, that's not so bad. So if you're having any challenges with children or grandchildren and they're saying, no, thank you, maybe it's related to that flavor and now the number of taste receptors they've got. And so that's why that food tastes so pungent to them and less so to us. We also know that over time, actually sensing related to bitter or salty taste tends to decline sooner than sweet or sour tasting does. So again, someone may feel like this food doesn't have that same salty kind of flavor and will then add more salt to their food. So that can present challenges if the person has some medical conditions. And then we also know that some medications and some chronic health conditions and some medical treatments can also impact our perception of taste. And then also there are some meds that will cause people to have dry mouths. And so that also can make a difference on how much saliva is excreted. And saliva is really important in helping us to masticate the food and helping the taste receptors that are actually located kind of underneath the tongue to be able to perceive those flavors. So these are some of the medical conditions that if you've got anybody in the family that's dealt with these, that can be impacting their taste and smell. Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, depending on if it's poorly controlled at the time. Also liver disease, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and then hypertension. And then there are also some environmental things that can impact this, like any type of tobacco use, whether a person's smoking or they're vaping or they're using chewing tobacco, that can impact the ability. Also, of course, any of us that have had dental procedures, and we know not only the anesthesia that's used can make a difference, but also if there's had to be any type of other kind of oral surgery done and some adjustment in structure or adjustment in even like the tongue or salivary glands have been affected. If someone's had a thyroid disease and had to have an impact on those glands, that can make a difference as well. And then there's some dysfunctions of what we call the endocrine system. The endocrine system includes, the glands in the body. So for example, the pancreas that makes insulin is a gland. So are a number of other glands in the body that if they're impacted, then that can also make a difference. And the other thing they found about high blood pressure is that it can also change the amount of sodium that is in our saliva. And so again, that can alter our taste perceptions. And then this is just a list of, again, treatments and medications that can affect our taste and smell. If you've had anybody in the family that's had chemotherapy or had radiation therapy, depending on the part of the body where that affected, particularly obviously in the mouth or the neck area, that again will affect those salivary glands. And so that can make a difference. And then there are a lot of medications listed here. And so I know, for example, I'll use my mom. My mom takes a couple of antihypertensives, and she said, darn it, my food just doesn't taste like it used to. And so again, if you have something that's, drying out so to speak, certain areas in the body, then that can impact how much saliva is produced, and just the mastication will be affected. So anyway, there's quite a list here, and so what this does not mean is that we should stop taking medications that we need so that we can taste better, but it just is something to be aware of, so that you know that that's what their cause is properly. So what's really the difference between spices and herbs? I think to me, the easiest way to remember it is that the herbs have leaves for the most part. A couple of them have flowers too, but for the most part, if you look on the right-hand side and you see all those are the herbs that have all the leaves. So the basil and coriander and bay leaves and rosemary and sage and tarragon, thyme, dill, oregano, parsley, all those are leafy kinds of things. Whereas the spices on the left tend to have the flowers and kind of the bulbs. So that's kind of a way to remember it. So what are some things that we can all do to enhance the flavor in foods? If you want to blend, if you want to use a couple different herbs or spices, then you would want to add those at the beginning of the cooking process. And if you want to still get some distinct flavor or something in particular, then if you can add those herbs in particular near the end of that cooking process, then it'll really enhance that flavor and make that stand out. Also, because whole spices and bay leaves actually release flavor slowly, then you might want to put those into your soup or your stew, and then of course gather them out of there at the end when you're ready to eat, so no one is getting a bay leaf in their mouth. They also suggest that, and all these things I should say come from the spice companies, so they have done their best to be sure that we understand why these can be so helpful, so that we'll purchase those items. You can add about 25% more spices and herbs if you're going to be also reducing the fat in the recipes. And then if you have something that's going to be an extended, something like the soups and the stews that are often made, for gatherings in the community or for our homes, if you can hold about a quarter of the seasonings and add them during the last 10 minutes, then again, that'll really give an enhanced flavor of those. They also suggest that if any of you are using any marinades, whether you make it yourself or whether you purchase it, that you actually double the cooking time stated in a lot of recipes, and that will again enhance that flavor. And then same thing kind of concept goes for uncooked things. Like if you're making a potato salad, or you're making a 7-layer salad, or whatever you're going to be putting together with, cooked potatoes or macaroni or whatever, rice, beans, that you put it in several hours ahead. That seasoning packet or what you're putting together on your own, so that gives it time to be absorbed in the oil, and then you can mix it in a couple times so you really get a great flavor. It's also important for all of us to know, how do we store herbs and spices, whether you're growing them in your garden or whether you're purchasing them. One thing is that you want to put them in a cool, dark place. You don't want to leave them out on the windowsill or something, because that sun will cause them to dry out and also to lose their potency and to lose some of their antioxidant properties that some of them have. Also important to date and label, and this is one of the things that I often forget to do, well-meaning, but what date did I open it? Just use a magic marker or a Sharpie. What date was it opened? And so that because what they suggest is that we only purchase enough to cover us for about a year. If we keep them longer, and I know I have some of those in my cupboard, but they're going to tend to lose their flavor. And so to enhance it, you want to be sure that you buy enough just to get you through for a year, or if you're making your own, you think about that. And then also what they suggest is that, if you do purchase one, when you put it into whatever your product is, your hot product in particular, that rather than just lift the lid and just pour it in right over the product, that you put some into the teaspoon, or you put a little bit in your hand to add it in, because if the steam from your hot soup or your stew goes up into that container, that is going to cause that spice to also lose its potency, and potentially, depending on what spice you got, you could even get some mold or something in there. So that's a lot about the spices. Now, the other thing to remember is that, again, if we use spices, then enhance the flavor in that way, then it can enable us to cut back on fat and sugar. And so the next couple slides are just giving you a couple suggestions on how you can cut back on fat. So one of them is this, whatever your recipe calls for, to try reducing the amount of fat in it by about a quarter. Some sources that you'll read will say you can cut it back as much as a third. My kind of rule of thumb is try a quarter and see how it comes out, because that fat is in there to obviously make it feel really good in our mouth and to help those flavors be accentuated, but it also adds to the structure, as does sugar. So to just say, I'm just going to take it all out and see what happens, or to cut it down by a half to 3/4 is probably not going to be a good choice. But what you can do is use some unsweetened or pureed types of fruits, and whether you mash up your own or you put it into the food processor or the blender and blend up something that's canned, those can be good ways to also add that body back in without adding the extra fat in. And actually then you're putting in more fiber and you're also adding, again, in some vitamins and minerals. So the fruit additives are a really great choice. Of course, as you know, the second bullet says, use reduced fat products, reduced fat mayo, reduced fat sour cream. You can also use like a non-fat or a low-fat milk, of course, instead of a higher fat milk, like half and half or cream. Also, of course, spraying our pans or a skillet or whatever you're cooking with. And then if you've got the time, if you can cook the meat, save the broth and the meat, stick it in your big pot, put it in the fridge, wait, or the other thing you can do is put a couple ice cubes in there. And that will get that fat to rise to the top so you can skim some of that off. And I know that there's hesitancy in that because that fat gives it flavor, but you can at least cut it back somewhat, and that will help you. For anybody in the family, any of us that are want to kind of keep track of our calories, that can be helpful. And then, of course, just any way that we can cook the meat to let the fat drain off, whether it's steaming or boiling or whatever way you can do before you mix it in with the other ingredients. And then some other good choices include adding extra fiber. Again, if you're going to do baked products and you want to try and increase the fiber, a good kind of rule of thumb is if it calls for a cup of flour, for example, do half of it as white and half of it as whole wheat as a starter. If you straight off just go to whole wheat instead of white, again, that's a denser flour, and you'll probably find that product won't rise as well for you, and you may need to do a little bit more experimentation with it to find out what the right kind of ratio is. And then, of course, adding beans. Beans are great to soups and stews. A lot of times, some people say, I don't like this bean or that bean. In my experience, using a black bean added to chilies or stews or cannelloni beans tends to be pretty acceptable. I know when I was growing up, my mom always used kidney beans. And I remember that the skin was thicker on those, and that was not a favorite. So I kind of had an aversion to beans for a while. And then I said, oh, but there are other choices. So think about adding them. Just don't increase the fiber tremendously. And it's, just such a good health method to add beans to our diet. Then this talks a little bit about, again, I'm getting back to sugar, cutting back by about a quarter for what the recipe calls for. In yeast breads, usually it's not a good idea to cut back on the sugar because that yeast needs that sugar to help the bread to rise. And then again, add some spices, and then you can also try, if you haven't, maybe using a quarter of the amount of sugar called for using powdered milk, because again, it's kind of going to add some bulk to it, but it will add also more protein. And then it can be helpful to reduce the calories. You're adding protein instead of carb. So this is a great resource. I started out by thinking I was going to put on the screen a whole bunch of different examples. And then I actually found this spiceadvice.com, and they actually have all the spice makers listed there with their different suggestions and a lot of recipes. So, it's tone, it's jerky, it's all those kinds. I think Pensie's is on there as well, which I know is kind of a well appreciated one as well. So try going to that and you'll find a lot of good stuff. And Peanuts gang are one of my favorite. I guess this is, I think, the 60th anniversary of when Peanuts holiday special first came out. So if you haven't watched it, I hope you get to watch it with your kids and grandkids. I know I'm going to. And I look forward to seeing you in the community. I've got one recipe on here. It's using a lot of raw veggies that are really healthy. The kids could put it together, the grandkids could put it together with you, a little veggie snowman, and you can make it however you like with whatever veggies you got, and that's a little bit of ranch in the middle to help the kids to want to dip and try it. So again, happy holidays, and I hope you have wonderful ones, you're healthy, and I'll see you in the new year.